This is February 1st, 2007. We're doing another oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our interviewee today is Axel Roth, who is sort of a double hitter for us. His father was one of the Von Braun team, and then he himself had a career at Marshall. So, would you like to start out by telling us a little bit about your father and your youth with him and so forth?
Sure, Bob. It's actually it's been thinking back on it. The first time I remember anything about my father and say rocketry as such was when we lived in Peenemünde on the Baltic in northern Germany. It's I remember him going to work and knowing that it had something to do with rockets. Beyond that, I didn't really know very much.
Maybe for the historical record, you should give his name as
okay.
He'd like to be called.
Right, yeah. His name is Ludwig Roth, and as a matter of fact, he liked to be called Roth. One of my brothers, as a matter of fact, likes to be called Roth too. But in any case, he worked in Peenemünde and started working with Dr. Von Braun back in those days. I remember, for instance, being out in the woods with my mother and seeing something come flying across that turned out to be the burner on a V1, the kerosene burner on top of the V1 that had come loose from one of the vehicles and was tumbling through the sky. I like to, we got bombed out in August of 1943 when the British had a big bombing raid on Peenemünde and pretty well wiped out the town. We left there, and then the following summer we came back to another town that was also on the Baltic, Kölpinsee, which was not too far from Peenemünde. And actually we lived in a house there where the first time ever I saw a V-2 rocket going up one evening up into the night sky. So that's probably my first launch that I'd ever seen, and that was in 1944. Mm-hmm. My father, then after that summer, we went back and down to central Germany, where we were till the end of the war. My father kept working there, and then he joined us. It was actually after the front had moved through the place where we lived. He had a sister in southern Germany whose husband had been killed. He was a Luftwaffe pilot. And ironically enough, I found out many years later that he had been shot down a few days after the invasion of Normandy, at Normandy. So he had gone to make sure that she and her children were okay, and then he came up to where we were living. After that, it was kind of interesting because he stayed with us for most of the summer. And
this would be the summer of 45.
Summer of 45, yes. And at the end of the summer, he went off somewhere for a while. I can't remember how long. He came back, and we were sitting at the dinner table one night when there was a knock on the door, and he went to answer it, and there were two MPs standing there, and asked him if he was Ludwig Roth, and he said yes, he was. And they said, well, we'd like for you to come with us, and they let us finish dinner, and we didn't see him again for about 2 weeks. And when he came back, he just had maybe 2 or 3 days, and he said he was going to the United States. It's kind of funny looking back on it now. I had no clue what the United States was or where it was. I knew about England, but I didn't know anything about the United States.
How old were you then?
Let's see, I was just, as a matter of fact, I turned 9 that year. And In 1945, yeah. And as a matter of fact, my father, I remember, brought me some chocolate bars and a book for my birthday, which is the 25th of October. But he left actually before my birthday. And actually, one of my brothers was born on November the 9th, and my father didn't see him for over a year. And then my father went to the United States, and the American Army moved our family down to a place called Landshut, which is a little bit east of Munich, Germany, and they congregated all the families of the people that they had brought to the United States. And we started school there, and then in December of 1946, we moved, and by ship on board boat, went to New York and then on to El Paso, Texas, where my dad had been for about a year.
How was it in El Paso from your point of view as a young fellow there?
Well, from the time that my father actually went there, and obviously with movies starting to come around, most of them American movies that we saw in Germany at the time, we were obviously well aware of the West and Texas, and we found out that's where he was, and Texas was part of the West. And I do remember the train ride from New York to El Paso, and getting off in El Paso, and my father meeting us at the train station, and then by taxi going out to Fort Bliss, and my disappointment at not seeing one cowboy or one Indian. But it was a really unique experience in El Paso. I, as a boy growing up there for about 4 years, 3 years, it was a great place. It really was. I very much enjoyed it, enjoyed the desert, enjoyed the mountains. My dad used to take us camping up in Ruidoso and Cloudcroft, and obviously we went to White Sands. It was a great place for a youngster, especially coming from Germany.
I can well imagine it would be.
Yeah.
Well, then, about 1950, roughly, you came to Huntsville.
That's right. We actually, we came here in August of 1950. My father and one of my brothers and our dog Prince and I came by car. My mother and my other three brothers came by train. I remember coming to Huntsville from the south and coming over the mountain there and looking at this beautiful Tennessee Valley, the Tennessee River, the bridges, and then the valley on beyond. And we moved, and my father had bought a house here on Central Avenue. The house is still there. And we moved into the house. That was somewhat almost on the outskirts of town. California Street was still a gravel road. The paving didn't start till just below where the Huntsville Hospital East is now, where the creek flows under. But it was somewhat unique. In Fort Bliss, we had all been together in one kind of community. Although we went to public school there, the kids did. But in Huntsville, we had to move into the community and be part of the community. And we, as far as I was concerned, I fit right in. Started Huntsville High School, as a matter of fact, just shortly after I got here. School started right after Labor Day, and we had gotten here about the middle of August, so a couple of weeks I was in high school here.
By then you had a good command of English, of course.
Oh, yes, yeah. English was actually, I started public school already in January of 1946, and by the summertime, I think I had a fairly good command of the English language. We did have some teachers that taught us during the summer, taught us English. As a matter of fact, her name was Miss Outlaw, and she was getting married at the end of the summer term that she spent with us Germans out at the annex, as it was called in Fort Bliss, and she was happy to change her name to something else.
I can believe that.
Yeah.
So you went to school here in Huntsville.
Yes.
And your father was working with Dr. Von Braun and the other members of the team.
Right, yeah. They were working at what later turned out to be, I guess, the Redstone vehicle and so forth. Went through 4 years of high school here. I remember one summer, and I think it was my senior year, or the summer between my junior and senior year, we went to the Cape and spent some time there, a week or so. I remember that. I do remember going to the Cape many years later, that it had really built up. There was nothing down at Cape Canaveral at the time I went in. I guess it was the summer of 1953. But my father was working on the Redstone and other things, and he had been the director of advanced development in Peenemünde, and had moved on to other jobs. I do know that he worked a lot with the contractor, especially Chrysler at the time, who was one of the prime contractors on the Redstone, and he worked a lot with them. And was, I guess, if I remember correctly, he was, at least at one time at the time that he left, which was in 1956, he was sort of the number 3 man under Von Braun at that time.
Well, then he left Marshall, did he? Or
Yes, he left. Well, actually,
that would
he
be the
left
Army.
before
Yeah.
Army.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I had started co-oping out here. I started co-oping in 1956 with the ABMA at that time, and my father was still here in 1956, but he left in June of 1956, and went to Solar Aircraft in San Diego. From there he went to Northrop Grumman, and then from there he to Northrop, I guess it was at that time, and then he went from there to Douglas Aircraft, and he headed up the old wet workshop for Skylab when he passed away.
When you finished school, where then? Finished college, where?
Okay, I started my freshman year at the University of Alabama, and actually started right after I finished high school in June of 1954, and went through summer school, and then went the full year, the 2 semesters after that. I wanted to get on the co-op program out here at Redstone Arsenal, and unfortunately at the time the University of Alabama was not offering a co-op curriculum for the students in the engineering school. So I transferred to Auburn University and started at Auburn in fall of 1955, and finished there in 1959 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. Matter of fact, told Bob one time that I took a course in learning how to use a slide rule under Bob.
So you got to know Bob Middleton very early then.
Yes, I did.
And you came to work then at Huntsville when you graduated.
Actually, what I did is I co-opted for several quarters and worked in the old test lab for a guy named Harry Johnston. Harry was a little upset because the first quarter that I worked here, my father was still here. I had a hard time getting a clearance, so my father suggested, since I couldn't work on, and at the time with the Army, everything was classified in some level, so I actually went to work my first quarter for Fritz Vandersay in the shops, and worked in the sheet metal shop and the machine shop and welding shop and so forth. My second quarter, then I actually went to work for Harry Johnson, who had actually hired me as a co-op. And by that time, of course, my father was leaving, but Worked for Harry Johnson on the propulsion test stand where we tested the early versions of the Jupiter engines, and worked there for a couple of quarters. I then got married, and so after that I worked during the summers as a summer student, always in the test lab out there. And then I did graduate from Auburn. Interestingly enough, I guess I felt like I had, my last quarter I had been a senior, so they had given me a GS5 salary. When I graduated from Auburn University, that's what I was offered, a GS5 salary. So I said, no, I've already worked at that level. So I took the big dollars, $120 a week, as I remember, at Lockheed in Sunnyvale. And actually for a year I worked on the Polaris missile program.
I didn't remember that.
Lockheed in Sunnyvale. Spent a lot of time up in Sacramento where they did the testing of the motors, the solid motors. And then after a year in 1960, I came back here and joined Marshall. As a matter of fact, I joined Marshall on July the 5th, 1960. So for many years I was not considered a charter member.
Oh, really?
By
5 days.
By 5 days. And but then by the time I retired, I think they decided anybody that joined in July of that year was a charter member.
What organization did you go into then?
I went into the structures group in what was then called Structures and Mechanics Laboratory, I believe it was. I worked for Bob Hunt, and he reported to Gustav Kroll, and Eric Gerner was Gus's deputy. Eric Gerner was a very close friend of my father's, and he was instrumental in getting me the job here at Marshall. And I worked in that particular area. As a matter of fact, I started off down at the old Hick building where we worked, and worked there for, I think, 3 or 4 years, and then we finally moved out to 4610 on the center in, I think, 1964, if I remember correctly. And during that time, I did a lot of shear and bending moment analysis of a variety of vehicles. In the early beginnings, we were trying to determine what we were going to use to go to the moon. That had not totally been established yet. Obviously, President Kennedy then proposed that we do go to the moon. And so we were looking at a number of vehicles called NOVA vehicles. Some was 4 engines, some was 1 engine, some was 5 engines, some was even, as I remember, 8 or 9 engines or something of that nature. We did all our calculations I did mine on a Marchant electromechanical calculator at that time. This was before the days of computers.
Yes, indeed.
And worked on that, worked on some interesting things on the side also. Paragliders of bringing back the booster on the S-1B stage. I've looked at that, and I know that Langley did a lot of wind tunnel tests on a, I forget, Rogallo glider, as I remember it, something like that. Did some structural assessment of that. Probably the most interesting job that I had, at least to me that I remember the most, is being on the crew safety panel and working with people there. That Dr. Kuttner was kind of the head of the crew safety panel, and we had people from Marshall and Johnson and the Kennedy, and obviously Kennedy in the early stage was not a center yet. It was part of Marshall Space Flight Center. Plus the contractors. The big thing was that the astronauts were part of the group also. And that was a lot of fun. We went to a lot of the contracting facilities and had meetings, and I did a lot of structural analysis and looking at ways to see if you could maybe during flight get an early indication if something bad was going wrong with the vehicle and so forth. So that was my early days here at Marshall.
Oh, what happened next in your career then?
Well, about 1966, I believe it was, I started getting restless, and I guess I realized that even though I thought of myself a pretty good structural engineer, I knew that I guess I didn't have it in me to be a great structural engineer. I worked well with people, and I wanted to get into some other positions. And actually, I went to one of my father's friends, Eric Neubert, and asked him to see if he could find something else for me to do. And it was quite a while before I finally heard from somebody, and actually ended up going to work for a guy named Ludi Richard in the technical systems office, and worked there for, I don't know, a couple of 3 years before there was a big reorganization, probably one of the first huge reorganizations that Marshall had. And in that reorganization, one of the things that was formed was the Central Systems Engineering Laboratory, and I was then ended up part of that.
Ludi was quite a character.
Ludi was. He was an amazing man. He to me, he could you take lots of different things and boil them down into a nutshell very quickly. He was very sharp. I thought he was very humorous too. He worked a lot, and I know he spent a lot of time with George Miller. As a matter of fact, at that time there was a program called Laugh-In, and one of the things they used to have these lines coming across the bottom of the screen saying so-and-so was alive and living someplace. And we had this thing on one of our chalkboards in the conference room that Ludi Richards was alive and living on the Gulf Stream, because George would take him every weekend and move him. They'd go everywhere across the country talking to contractors. Yeah, Ludi was a great guy.
So what year did that reorganization take place? Do you remember?
I want to say it must have been around 1969. If I remember correctly. And actually, I'd been working in building 4202 for Ludi, and then I went to work for Fred Hammers in out in the old test lab building, 4666, and we worked out there for, I can't remember how long, and then I got moved again and went to work for Carlos Haygood, who was doing some of the engineering. I was in the engineering office in the laboratories working with Carlos Haygood on the Skylab program. And actually, my roommate, I really didn't have a whole lot to do when I first started over there. One of my roommates, or office mates, I should say, was a guy named Larry Frederick. And Larry was a real go-getter kind of guy. And he was working on something called the EREP program, Earth Resources Experiment Package, that was going to fly on Skylab. And he said, hey, if you've got some time, I really need some help. And so I started working with Larry on the EREP program, and they had a number of instruments there that needed development. I remember going to Martin at the time up in Denver, Colorado, because they were the integrator of the Skylab. The package was going to be in the multiple docking adapter for Skylab and in the experiment window that was being developed. We went to the window developer, which is a company called iTech, as I remember, out in Monrovia, California. Ironically, one of my younger brothers lived there at the time, so got a chance to see him. iTech, one of the cameras I remember was made in a company, iTech, north of Boston. So I got to travel up there. Obviously went to St. Louis where a lot of the integration was taking place and so forth. It's a great time. I got to meet a lot of people during that time, and not only people from other centers, but also the contractor community, different people from the centers here and so forth. It was kind of almost something that I think my first 20 years was NASA. I'd only been to Washington, D.C. one time, which was kind of unique.
Yes.
Anyway, I made up for it later on, unfortunately. But
Well, we sort of skipped over the Apollo years, and you were involved in that, of course.
Apollo, basically, I worked in the structures area, as I said, early on, and then when I was working for Ludi, I worked in the systems engineering, and the unfortunate thing during those years was that the organization that Ludi headed, everybody respected Ludi, but that organization was sort of an add-on. There were a lot of other people doing similar things. The laboratories at that time were king. And to get in and out of the laboratory, you had Jerry Mack in the Astronautics world, you had Alex McCool and his systems group, and the old PNVE, and you had Louis McNair in the Air Ballistics Lab. And they were doing the systems engineering, and we were just sort of extra, you might say. So my years, I don't remember them very fondly, my years in the technical systems office. And I was very happy when we reorganized and got into the thing. And as a matter of fact, for Apollo itself, other than doing the structures work and working with the crew safety panel, I really didn't have that much to do with it after that.
Well, the crew safety was essential.
Crew safety panel, I think, was probably that, and some of the structural analysis that I did once we got into the design of the Saturn V, the S1C stage, the S2, the S4B. I was involved in all of those things from a structures viewpoint. Those were very, very good years, up to 1966. And the next probably 2.5 to 3 years were kind of years that I'd probably like to forget, as a matter of fact. I felt like I didn't accomplish a whole lot.
So Skylab became something of a highlight then.
Skylab became my next highlight, yes. And as a matter of fact, after working the EREP package, I was transferred up into George Hardy's organization, which was a program office. I'd been in the engineering group for many years, so now I was in George Hardy's organization working for Dick Marmon. And one of the jobs I got in that organization was to do a what-if analysis. And I had some contractors from Martin, and we looked at all sorts of things that could go wrong with the Skylab, and what we would do about it, what the best way to get around it. There's some interesting things. One of the things that we thought about is the meteoroid shield not deploying, that the bands wouldn't separate, and so the meteoroid shield kept tight around, and so we talked to the people like the Dwayne Littles and the George Hobsons about the thermal conditioning. And we looked at that. What we didn't look at is the meteoroid shield being totally gone,
Yes.
like what turned out to be the real thing. But I think it at least gave the people like George and Wayne some ideas, at least at that time, what to think of. I do remember one of the things is talking about what if the ATM did not deploy. It was deployed with motors on a cable. And the cable was actually fairly thin, but it's obviously made of pretty wound steel wires. And so we actually went down and talked to the crew and to see what could be done. If it did, could the crew, in fact, do anything about it? And the JSC people were understandably kind of standoffish from the viewpoint of safety for the crew. Obviously, if the thing didn't deploy, should we dock? How would the crew actually get to the thing? Tethers and things of that nature. One of the things somebody came up with, well, how about using a bone saw to saw the cable in two and then have the crew actually push the ATM over? And actually the crew guys thought it was a great idea, except one of them asked him, a bone saw? What do we need a bone saw for? Why do we have one of those on board? But that was an interesting time for me. I worked on that for probably 6 or 7 months during that time. And then as we got closer and closer to actually flying Skylab, I moved into a little different and got into what I would call operations kind of mode. I worked over at the HOSC or sat in on some simulations that they had over there. The HOSC was kind of a third line of defense, really. They had obviously the main group at JSC, the control center there, once the crew got up there. They had a backup room, and then they had the HOSC as sort of a third tier. But we had all the experts on the systems on Skylab there. We had some of them down in Houston during the first mission and so forth. But anyway, slowly got to getting into that mode. And then I guess we flew the first, the Skylab went up. And then, of course, the problem with the heat shield, and I did work over at the HOSC at that time, right after that. Spent a lot of nights. We worked shifts because you had to be up 24 hours a day. People like George Hobson and Wayne Littles just worked incredible hours. They'd actually sleep out there on cots that we had set aside. I didn't have to do that, thank goodness, but there was a lot of hard work going on trying to save the thing. We obviously came up with the idea of first the umbrella out of the scientific airlock, and then later on a more durable heat shield for the temperatures. Obviously in the workshop got pretty warm, I do remember being on the console and watching the actual Skylab going up, and then hearing the voices from down at JSC, you know, talking about, and around the HOSC there, talking about instrument failure and so forth and so on when the heat shield came off, and also one of the solar arrays. I think we were incredibly lucky that the whole thing didn't go by the wayside. But I think that NASA, as people have said in other venues, that I think that's when the best comes out in the Marshall, JSC, the whole NASA world. It's when we're in deep trouble. And I think that we really were at that time, and we came out of it with flying colors. It was really a great effort by everybody concerned. Then the crew went up, and during the first mission, manned mission, and I can say that I guess we only had men at that time, I stayed at Marshall, worked in the HOSC, and we had a counterpart in Houston called the FOMR, Flight Operations, I can't remember what the FOMR stands for, something room. Anyway, they had several of the Marshall folks were down there in direct, visible almost contact with the people in the control center down at JSC. And then we were in contact with them, and we would relay. The JSC control room would ask us for specific things on different items. Especially, I remember the batteries seemed to go bad, and we had our experts, a guy named Woosley, I think, up here working on them, and came up with a lot of good fixes. It was obvious that, I think during the Apollo days, I think the JSC controllers really felt they knew everything about the vehicle.
Yeah.
I think on Skylab they found out, they thought they did, but they didn't know it, and they got a lot of appreciation for the expertise here at Marshall. Then the second and third missions, I actually went down to Houston and spent about 7 months down there during that time. And it was a great experience. I got to know a lot of the people down there firsthand. Got to work with them on a daily basis. I got their respect. They got my respect on the kind of things they did. And again, it was just a fantastic kind of working relationship. As a matter of fact, though, the friends that I made and colleagues that I had at JSC during that time, I used them for the rest of my career. And a lot of them, not only at JSC, but also in industry, and as some of them left to go into industry. It was a great time. To me, looking back on Apollo and Skylab, and then later on talk about in a little bit Space Lab, it was such a wonderful time for me to have come along. I feel so lucky because it was a great time in human exploration, you might say, into space. And I was part of it. I always consider myself just so lucky to have been part of it. I think there was a lot of fun had by all of us, a lot of hard work, a lot of many hours that you didn't get paid for. You didn't care. You just wanted to get the job done. And I think we lost some of that after Skylab and Space Lab. I think when the shuttle came along, I think for some period of time they had it also, and then slowly things just dissolved. I think the people today have a chance to relive that. If they could just get their head on right and make the right thing. But anyway, we finished up Skylab. I think we had 3 great teams up there. I got to know them a lot better in later years, and they were a great bunch of guys, did a lot of great work up there. And we had a lot of fun down in Houston, and we worked with the JSC and the control guys down there. When I left Skylab, I came back, and I'll have to say that I remember reading that what's the guy that was the second guy on the moon? Can't think of his name. It was Armstrong. Anyway, he sort of had a breakdown, I guess, of sorts from what I read. And I could understand it, because during the Skylab, especially that last 7 months that I was down there, every day you had to go. You knew that if you didn't go, you felt like your job was really important. You had to be there. If you weren't there, something was going to fall through the cracks. And so for 7 months, I lived like that. And then I came back to Marshall and worked on the Space Lab program, worked under Jack Lee. And suddenly, that daily, you had to be there. You were part of people flying that were out in space, that depended on you in some degree. And that wasn't there anymore. And I had sort of a down period, I'll have to say. But then it came back out. Space Lab got to be a program. I worked with Luther Powell, directly for Luther Powell under Jack Lee. And
what was your role in that?
I was sort of a structures systems engineer. Luther was Jack's deputy, but Luther was also head of the systems engineering group. And then I was sort of his de facto deputy, you might say, over the systems engineering group. And but structures was, since that had been my background, was sort of in the forefront of what some of the things. The interfaces I had with our colleagues over in Europe was primarily in the structures area that I did. And slowly got to know them. Had a lot of respect for them. I think that it was certainly a different getting used to their way of thinking and way of doing things, getting used to that you're not only dealing, say, with one nationality, but that you're dealing with a whole host of nationalities. My direct counterparts in structures, for instance, were Alan Thurkettle, an Englishman, and let's see, I can't think of his name, but the other guy was a Frenchman. And and Alan Thurkettle was sort of arrogant, and the Frenchman was just a really nice guy. And the one thing that I do, since we did a lot of our interfaces by telephone, when I called Michel Nero was his name. When I would call Michel, I would always go into the conversation asking him several questions about his family and what's going on and so forth, so I could get used to his accent till we got to the real work, so that I would really understand what he was saying. Sometimes I had a tough time with Michel's accent. The interesting thing is they all spoke English, you know, and we obviously didn't speak all of their languages. But what a great thing Space Lab was. We worked, I guess I worked Space Lab, let's see, Skylab was over in 1974, and I think I worked for Space Lab for, gosh, a number of years. Can't remember exactly when I finally left the Space Lab program office organization, but it I know Luther Powell left to go. I think that Dr. Lucas sent him over to Europe to be a direct with the ESA organization in Noordwijk, Holland, and so I took over the systems office in name, but not sort of. I did it on a daily basis. I don't think I was ever. I know I didn't get my promotion to a 15 at that time. But in any case, lot of fun, lot of great work with the Europeans, and one of the things that I really remember that we did, and I think one of the things that I'm not sure whether it's happening out at Marshall today, is the fact that we were developing the Space Lab at the same time the orbiter was being developed. And so the interfaces between the two vehicles, we had to really keep a tight eye on that. And so I remember that Jack Lee and I was sort of the interface to JSC also. And we met with Glenn Lunny, who headed up the orbiter program at that time. And Glenn said, why don't we do like we did on ASTP, the program that the JSC, the Apollo with the Russians. Said, we just got everybody together and we sat them all down and wouldn't let them leave till they had the interface control documents ironed out. So we said, okay. So what we did is during early December, one year, I can't remember the year, it must have been 1975. We took Marshall people out there. We took the Johnson people out there. Went to Rockwell out in Downey, California. We had the European Space Agency. We had ERNO. We had, of course, Downey, who was developing the orbiter at the time. So we had everybody together, and we put them up. We were going to have 3 ICDs, a structures, and an environmental one, and a, sort of you might say, electronic software one. And we had 3 teams, and then we had, the teams get together, and if they came to an impasse, they would bubble it up to another level group, which I was part of, and myself and several other people. And then the final one was when we all came together, and Jack Lee and Glenn Lundy and everybody had signed off on it. And I dare say we spent about 2 weeks out there at Downey, and working very hard, long hours every day, and over the weekend also. And we probably hammered out, I would say, 75% of those 3 ICDs. Got them all signed and sealed, and after that they were always part of the shuttle change board meetings and so forth. I remember one of the funny things happened when we went out there. Excuse me a second. We flew on United Airlines. And when we were out there, United was talking about a strike. So, of course, all of us were worried about getting back to Huntsville. Well, John Thomas was head of the engineering side of the house. And they were instrumental, critical to the ICDs. So and some of them were wanting to go back then before the strike took place and so forth. So John said, I tell you what, just give me your airplane tickets, and I'll take care of your flight reservations and all like that. I'll just take care of everything. So all of the guys in engineering gave John their tickets. And then John said he wasn't going to let them have them back till they got that ICD finished. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, some leverage there.
Yeah. But anyway, over the next couple of years, probably a year or so, we had a couple of more big meetings out at Downey and finished up the ICDs to the degree ICDs are ever finished. Again, my work with the people down at JSC that I've done over the years, both in the structures and the Skylab era, really helped out for me to get things done in areas that I worked in and so forth. And then I guess it must have been early 1980s. It's kind of ironic. An opportunity came. Obviously, the Space Lab, once the missions were defined, Space Lab 1, Space Lab 2, Space Lab 3, crews, science crews were elected for that. And obviously, they wanted to have somebody to run that organization, or the teams that followed Space Lab 1, Space Lab 2, and Space Lab 3. They decided, and this was done before I even knew about it. I think there were a lot of discussion with Jim Kingsbury and so forth. That team was going to be housed in the old Science and Engineering organization, and they would be called operations teams, and they would have a leader called the Payload Operations Director. And so some announcements, and you may remember at Marshall they put out announcements for promotions on what we call blue sheets. And blue sheet came out for the Payload Operations Director, and they wanted 2. They wanted one for Space Lab 1 and one for Space Lab 2, since those were going to be the initial 2 Space Lab flights. And I decided to apply for it just because I wanted to see if it was a GS-15 position, and I felt like I had some background in that area, and I wanted to see, if I would make the grade. I already knew that, like in a lot of those things, and probably people in the human resources area will argue with me on this, but a lot of those positions already had a name attached to it. Not all, but quite a number.
There was
of
some
them.
earmarking
Yeah.
going on.
Anyway, I knew that, and again my memory fails, who the pod for Spacelab 1. I know Dick Tinius was slated to be the payload ops director for Spacelab 2 because he had asked me to apply for it and so forth. And but during the process, then Dick Tinius got a better offer, and my name was selected. Well, once you're selected, it's kind of hard to turn things down. And so I became the payload ops director on Spacelab 2 and left the Spacelab program office at that time.
Let's see, Gene Urban was the
Gene Urban was the
scientist,
mission scientist, yeah.
Right.
And
so you must have worked with him some then.
yeah, I did. Worked very well with Gene, and it was a new experience for me, putting together the team that I had to have, because we were going to be working 3 shifts, so each position that we had, you had to have 3 people. Even Gene Urban, I think he and Stu Clifton was his
Stu
kind of
Clifton was his
deputy, and they worked like 12-hour shifts. The result was, no, we had 2 positions, 2 people for each position, because we were going to work like 12-hour shifts, because it's only supposed to last like a week or maybe 10 days or something along that order. So putting that team together and getting to know those people, and then putting all the documentation together that was required for doing it, working with the crew to put the crew procedures together, because one of our people was a crew interface communicator, and having to work on a daily basis with the crew, primarily the science crew, but we did also work. Gordy Fullerton was the commander of that flight, and Roy Bridges was the pilot on the flight. Great people to work with. No problems at all. Everybody was working together. My counterpart at JSC was John Cox. John and I worked just super together. He was a lead flight director on that mission. Lee, I can't think of his last name. But anyway, they actually had 3 teams for each position down there. So anyway, we worked through that. We worked with the crew. We worked with the scientist, which sometimes was a little bit difficult. But I think we had probably, in my opinion, a really great working together group of scientists. And I think a large part was due to Gene Urban's work in that regard. We had some real, you might say, prima donnas. Untitled from out at Lockheed
yes.
was one, and let's see, there was another guy from the university up in Maryland. Anyway, he was kind of a prima donna. But then we had some other guys. There was a guy, and for the life of me, I can't think of his name. He was from England. And I do remember one meeting. He was actually here. We were in a meeting here at Marshall, and somebody came in and said he had a phone call that he ought to take, and he went out, and when he came back, just in conversation, I said, "Who was that?" And he said it was Margaret Thatcher. She said she was going in to talk to Ronald Reagan and wanted to know if there was anything he wanted her to tell Ronald Reagan.
That's a great story.
So we had some real powerful PIs on our mission. Oh, another one was from the Naval Research Lab.
Housey?
No, Günther Bruckner.
Oh yes, Gunther.
Was on one of the science guys. But again, one of the issues with the science people, although we had a lot of good science plan for the mission, was that they had to realize that Space Lab 2, since it was the first pallet-only mission, was more of an experiment mission. It was checking out the pallet systems and so forth, and that would take that would take precedent over any science going on. And that obviously was going to be a concern to everybody. Actually, in the end, it actually worked out fairly well. Or I think the scientists were pretty happy with what they ended up getting, except for one, because one of the things that we had an experiment on board where it was actually supposed to let loose a satellite, and we were going to fly around it, and we were also going to do plasma where the engines would actually fire and over certain ground stations, and the experiment would look up into the plasma and see what effects it had on it. The unfortunate thing, what happened on Space Lab 2 was that on the way up the hill, we lost an engine. And so that put us in a different orbit than we were essentially in, and to try to get us fairly close to the orbit, they used a lot of the propellant. And as a matter of fact, during that whole mission, we were always fighting with the guys in the JSC control room about how much propellant was in. And Jerry Wittenstein was really great. He was on my team, and Jerry worked with those guys. He'd even asked him, he said, "Don't you have some more? Did you count what's in the pipes and all this sort of stuff?" And I think by and large, we got everything that the scientists could have hoped for out of that mission. It was a great mission. John David Bartow and Lauren Acton were the quote, real true scientists. We had one guy, Story Musgrave, who's kind of a legend in his own time. He was on board. I mentioned Roy Bridges but the other ones, we had Tony England and I'll think of his name in a moment. The other mission specialist that was on that flight. Great group, great team. We all worked together. One of the things I might mention of the cooperation that we dealt with, Space Lab was the first time that Marshall people could directly interface with somebody in space. We worked with the science guys up there, and we had our timelines laid out so that our crew interface communicators, they were the ones who then communicated with the flight crew, or at least the science crew. And so there was a big flap over when could we start doing that. And we had our timeline laid out, and John Cox and his flight controllers down at JSC had their timeline lined up, and there was a big fight. At least John and I heard about it. So John called me one day and he said, "Hey, my guys don't want to give up." And the difference turned out to be about 8 hours overlap. They didn't want to give it up till this point. We wanted to start at this point. So John called me up one day and he said, "Axel, why don't you and I each take the timeline, take a look at it ourselves, pick a point where we would think would be a good time for the other one to be able to communicate with the crew." We did that. Obviously, I did with the help of some of my guys, but and I'm sure John did too. But we came up with a time, and as it turned out, there actually ended up being about a half-hour gap.
Really?
We got that close that actually there was a gap in there. In other words, I was willing to wait later. John was willing to do it earlier, so we had to bridge that gap. But in any case, just the super cooperation with the crew.
Well, the results scientifically from the mission were great too.
Yeah.
I know that.
One of the comical things about it was I worked Space Lab 1 during the mission of it, and then because of delays and other things, Space Lab 3 which Carolyn Greiner was the payload ops director on, actually flew before Space Lab 2. So we were actually the third one in line. But it was a great mission. Again, it was one of those things that at the end of it, you know, I said, well, what am I going to do now? You know, roll over to be a payload ops, because there were quite a number of payload Space Lab missions, so I was just kind of rolled over to be a payload operations director on another mission, and was working toward that at the time. Then when I got a call from my old friend Luther Powell one day, and he said, how would you like to come to work on the space station and be my operations manager on the space station? So I said yes, and so I left Space Lab behind and
Moved on to space station.
went on to space station, which I ended up doing, when I finished my career, I always called it my first, second, or third life in space station, because I had actually 3 different times I was working on space station. Space station was in its earliest sort of infancy, you might say, although they've been working on it for a number of years already. And I did.
Was this before or after Reston
This
shut
is
down?
before
all right.
Reston, yeah. And we actually had, at the time, 4 work packages. We were actually what's called Work Package 1, and they had one down in Houston, I think was 2. I think that Glenn, of course it was before it was called Glenn, was Work Package 3, and then they had one at Goddard, Work Package 4, and each of us had certain things that we were responsible for. It was really, again, the only problem with it was I'd been used to dealing with real hardware, and suddenly I was in what they called a paper organization, paper view-graph engineering, as a lot of people call it. And a lot of meetings between us and JSC, and we'd go to the contractors, and we didn't, at the time I joined, we had 2 prime contractors helping us in Work Package 1. That was Martin Marietta out of Denver, and then Boeing, largely out of Huntsville here. And so during that time, my time there, we then had to down select the one contractor, which I was part of that selection process. And we finally, Boeing was selected to that, and then we had to, of course, negotiate the contract with them, which was an interesting thing for me. I'd never done that before, and doing that. I worked on space station and from 1985 or 86, I think it was, for a couple of years or so. And again, a lot of the people at JSC were people I had known and worked with in the past, so that was good. As a matter of fact, interfaced some with Gordy Fullerton, and then the commander on our mission on Space Lab 2. He headed up a group down at JSC that we interfaced with, especially since I was manager of the operations office there for Luther. And then things got divvied up a little bit more, and supposedly the Work Package 1 was going to get the habitation module. So I moved over to head up the habitation module development, and Carolyn Greiner then came down and took over the operations office. About that same time, well, that was later on. Anyway, worked on the habitation module. We had preliminary design reviews on it. Obviously had the crew up here, had Boeing doing. They had a couple of the old Skylab astronaut, Jerry Carr, one of them, was Boeing had hired them as consultants. So that's where I got to really know some of the old Skylab guys. But anyway, then reorganization. Luther left, retired, and went to work for one of the contractors, and Ray Tanner took over the office. I might mention that before that happened too is when Challenger happened. I remember being in a conference room that we were meeting there at Marshall and on the space station in the conference room, and of course we turned on the TV and watched the launch, and as usual I've always held my breath till the solids were gone. I guess having a lot of respect for solids when I worked at Lockheed in Sunnyvale, those things were, at least in my opinion at the time, were always suspect, you know, and I really wondered why.
I can understand that.
To solids. But when the thing went the two different directions, and at first I thought it was separations, then I thought to myself, no, that doesn't look like it. Of course, then we all found out what happened. Obviously, it broke up the meeting and all like that. So that was kind of devastating, I think, for all of us at the time. Challenger happening. To me, much more so than the fire on Apollo. But anyway, Ray Tanner took over the office and reorganized it, and I found myself basically sort of without a job. And my old friend Dick Tinius came to the rescue after about, I guess it was 3 or 4 or 6 months, something like the order of that. He headed up the chief engineer's office for Spacelab at the time, and that's about the time that Reston got started that you mentioned a while ago, because after Challenger all of that changed. They said there's too much at the centers, not enough at headquarters, so they moved a big organization up at Reston, and Dick Tinius was supposed to go to Reston to take over one of the offices up there. And he called me up and said, hey, you might be interested in this job. And I said, yeah. As a matter of fact, I think within 10 minutes I went up to Jack Lee's office, who was the deputy center director at the time, and told Jack that I heard that Dick Tinius was leaving and I would really like to have that job. And sure enough, within a day or so, I got to be chief engineer of the Spacelab office that supported Harry Kraft at the time. And so it was kind of funny. The chief engineer's office at that time, I think, is something that J.R. Thompson got started. I think it was a great thing, but different organization used it to different levels. Harry was kind of an in-between kind of level, because there was still a Spacelab program office under Bill Johnson at the time, and Bill had several sort of engineers working for him, and it was kind of hard for the people that worked for me to kind of work with them and also work with Harry Kraft's organization. So it took a lot of working together to get that worked out.
A little finesse here and there.
Yeah, it really did. But anyway, so I moved over as chief engineer of Spacelab. So worried both about the Spacelab design itself, but also for the different Spacelab missions coming up. I had a person for each of the missions that made sure that all the engineering was done on those missions, and everything was worked up until the final thing. And then during the mission, that person and myself and others would sit on the console over in the HOSC, which where the payload ops director had moved to in the meantime from Johnson Space Flight Center. So I worked Spacelab for several years, both the development, what was left of the development of Space Lab, which really wasn't all that much, it's just upgrades to certain items, and working the interfaces, obviously, with the orbiter, and then also working the payload side, the payload integration, and making sure that all the systems were done and so forth in the Space Lab payload side of the house. The racks were tested and made sure that all the documentation was there. And spent several years in that organization. And again, probably if I had to say, that was my most fun job. You worked on a daily basis, was real hardware. You saw the hardware fly. You saw the results when after it flew. It was just really super great job. And then the blue sheet thing came up again, and I saw where George Hobson, who was head of the, by that time, the head of the space station program at Marshall, was looking for a deputy. And it was a senior executive position, so obviously I would wanted to aspire to one of those. And so I decided to apply for it. I'll have to say, I remember talking to Jim McMahon, who I reported directly to as chief engineer, and told him that I wanted to do that. I said, I really don't want the job. I've been in space station and I don't want to go back there, but I do want the center to know that I'm interested in the senior executive position. And as I was leaving his office, I remember him telling me, he said, you know that if they choose you, you got to take it. And I said, yeah, I do. I really didn't, to be quite honest, I didn't think I had much of a chance. And it was kind of nice. I put in my application and basically forgot about it. And a few months later, I got a call from Wayne Littles, who was the deputy center director at the time, from his secretary, and she said she wanted to set up the interview. And I said, what interview? You know, and she said, well, for the space station deputy position. I said, oh. And I guess the nice thing to me was I didn't worry about it all that time. I didn't even think about it. And so I went to the interview and again, basically forgot about it. I knew some of the other candidates that had been interviewed. And so again, I just sort of shrugged it off. And I remember that Harry Kraft, Harry was kind of known to, on a yearly basis, take a tour of Europe, you might say, with the engineering groups and so forth, to the various contractors that still, for Space Lab itself, for the payloads and so forth. And I told him he couldn't go over there, that he was not allowed to talk engineering, that he was a program office man, and I was the only one that could talk engineering. And so he had to take me with him. So anyway, we had just come back. It was the 4th of July weekend. We had just gotten back on like the 3rd of July.
What year was this?
This must have been 1989 or 90. I can't remember which. 89 or 90, though.
All right, that's close enough.
And sitting there eating dinner, the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's George Hobson. And George tells me that I had been selected to become his deputy. And it just, quite frankly, floored me. It really did. I was really shocked. And then I had to think, I said, well, I got to go back to space station again. But anyway, then within a fairly short while, I moved over to George Hobson to become his deputy and worked there for several years. As a matter of fact, I worked there through the end of '93. Yeah. But I was his deputy and did basically, you know, somebody, I remember giving a briefing to some students one time, and one of the young guys asked me, so what do you do? And I said, whatever my boss tells me to do. And that's, George was a hands-on kind of guy, and we didn't have separate duties as such. I did basically what George wanted me to do, and I was happy to do it. George was a great mentor, really. George is one of these guys, he might sound a little country and all like that, but the man has got a very, very sharp mind. And I've always liked George, always respected him, and still do. But it was really nice working as a deputy for George. We had a lot of good times. We worked hard. We finally got Space Station Freedom, as it was called at that time. We worked with Reston a lot. Spent a lot of time up in Reston during that time. Worked with the people up there. A lot of those were JSC folks, and my old friend John Cox, who had been the lead flight director for Space Lab 2, he was head of operations out there. And
Jim Sisson was there too, I think.
Sisson had left, I think, by the
then,
time
okay.
That I got up there. But in any case, it was, again, a great time because hardware was starting to be developed. As a matter of fact, I still got a little plastic thing with some chips. The first chips that Boeing turned off were one of the pieces of hardware that was intended for Space Station Freedom. It was really nice. We first were in building 4200, and then we moved to the new building 4203. And I remember I had an office that had windows that looked toward the north, and you didn't see any of the rockets or anything like that. You just saw the mountains and the greenery and the fields of grass and so forth, which came in kind of handy later on. But I worked on a lot of panels for George. Worked on, a lot of times they addressed and they would set up a panel to look at this or to look at that, and it always seemed to be the deputies that were on those panels. So did a lot of traveling around the country to the various contractors we had. Great opportunity, again, to meet the people and work with them, and did a lot of presentations, showing people to the mock-up that we used to have one of the buildings out at Marshall. Senator Shelby, the Prince of one of the countries in Europe, I remember. So you got to meet some really neat people while you were trying to tell them what it was that Space Station was all about. Helped in some of the development of some of the things over there. And they were doing, the engineering guys were doing some great things that Marshall was responsible for on the space station. By that time, the HAB module had kind of gone away to some degree. But we were still looking at a lot of, obviously, the human interfaces. And that's one of the things that George kind of let me do, the human kind of stuff and the operations kind of stuff that was over in my bailiwick. And then, of course, a couple of things happened. One, we got a new administrator. Dan Golden came on board. And then the administration changed. Bill Clinton came in as the president, and suddenly Space Station seemed to be in real jeopardy. Money was cut. We were really scrambling around trying to figure out what to do. I know that Dan Golden was really trying to do his best to figure out how to save Space Station. A story that I heard, and it was told from somebody that I think knew pretty well. It said that, of course, Dan Golden had actually been picked by the Republican administration under Ronald Reagan and he was now working for President Clinton. But anyway, that he was called over to, that Dan Goldin was called over to the White House, and that I think the White House guy, Stephanopoulos, and somebody else got him in a separate room before seeing President Clinton and told him, here's what President Clinton wants to do. Basically, he wants to do away with space station altogether, just cancel it. He wants to cut back on the budget of NASA to about $1 billion a year, phase the shuttle out, and just do whatever NASA could do for about $1 billion a year. And the story goes that Dan Goldin told Stephanopoulos, he said, are you the guys who want to kill President Kennedy's dream of humans in space? And then he told him that he would do what he could, you know, to get the space station back in the budgetary and financial good graces and so forth. And I'll have to say, a lot of people have reservations about what kind of an administrator Dan Goldin was, myself included. But if he did that for NASA, I think the man probably saved NASA as we know it today, if that truly happened. And like I said, I have it on pretty good authority that it indeed did. Obviously, then kind of Dan Goldin, and here's the thing I didn't like about the man, you know, he wanted to bring in a new team, he wanted to revitalize space station in a different, he said the Team for Freedom had wasted too much money and was costing too much, there's a lot cheaper way to do this. And so in the end, basically, we, as George Hobson likes to tell me, we were fired from our jobs, and a new team took over, some of which were totally new people, had not worked on the space station. Obviously, some had. We still had the contractors, and then they went about consolidating the contract and giving the total contract to Boeing. This was after I left, obviously. But it was in the waning days of Space Station Freedom. I remember a lady, and I can't remember from what newspaper or magazine she was, came to interview me in my office in 4203. And we were talking about, you know, that, yeah, space station was in dire straits and that we were in real trouble. And, you know, I said, yes, we are, and we're trying our best to figure out, you know, how to turn this thing around and so forth. And she said, how do you deal with this on a daily basis? And I said, well, when it gets too hard, and it turned out it was the late fall of the year, and when you looked out the big window that I had, there was a guy had planted this, I guess it was winter wheat or something for his cows, or grass anyway. There was this big golden, huge meadow, and just as we looked out, the wind was blowing, kind of waves going through the meadow, and I said, well, come over here and take a look at this. When I get too bad off, you know, I just come over here and look out the window for a little while, then everything is okay again. But yeah, we, at the end of, you know, George and I were wondering what we were going to do, what the center was going to give us to do, and during the latter few years time, we were really wondering about that. I'll have to say, during the summer of '93, I ended up as part of a team. First, I was part of a team down at JSC that Gene Kranz was heading up, looking at how best to do the operations of space stations. And I was part of that team for several months. And then I was asked to be on a team they were going to look at 3 different versions of space stations. This is when Dan Goldin was really going to make it cheaper. We were looking, I think they had a team at Marshall under Charlie Darwin that was looking at basically Space Station Freedom. They had one at JSC that was looking at a totally new concept of space station, or pretty much a totally new concept. And then they had a group up at Langley that was going to look at sort of something in between, and I was part of that group. And as a matter of fact, our present NASA administrator, Mike Griffith, was sort of our headquarters contact, who would come down every week and meet with us.
So you got to know him well then?
Yes, I did. And I worked up at Langley. I spent most of that summer and some of the fall up in Langley. I'd go up there and spend 2 weeks and come home for 2 or 3 days and back up there for 2 or 3 weeks, and looking at all kind of aspects. And the Langley folks, we had a team that included Langley, Marshall, JSC. I think we had somebody from Glenn Research Center also there, and so we got to be pretty close, the team up there, and we had a lot of fun. And I think that Mike Griffin at the time kind of was on the way out, or maybe he was kind of loose, and Mike is just a supremely smart guy. I got to know that when knowing him up there. But one of the interesting things that happened up there, probably the way I got to know him best of all, was he found out I like to play golf. And Mike is a very, very good golfer. And so he decided, since there was a golf course there at Langley on the base, every afternoon about 4 o'clock we'd go out and we'd play 9 holes or something like that. As a matter of fact, it got so where he would fly in. He flew his, I don't know whether it's his own airplane, but he flew a plane in. He would come into the meeting. The first thing he'd usually do is look at me and said, "Have we got a tea time this afternoon yet?" But anyway, went through that, and then of course that kind of died down, and they decided to go with, really, when it boils right down to it, was Space Station Freedom, except the Russians started getting involved to a great degree, which is, I think, a way that Golden really saved Space Station and endeared himself to the Clinton administration, because they were trying to help the Russians get on their feet. Mm-hmm. This was a good way to do that. In any case, at the end of that year, or toward the end of that year, I found out that that I was going to have been tapped to be the deputy of program development. Bill Snoddy, the previous deputy, was retiring at the end of the year.
We interviewed Bill last week.
You did, yeah.
Or earlier this week it was.
Anyway, Bill and I met a few times, and Bill and I've known Bill for many years in any case, but so we had a very good transition, and went up there and worked. Jim McMillian actually headed up the Office of Program Development at the time, so got to work back with Jim McMillian again. And Jim and I, sat down and kind of divvied up the workload, and I took the propulsion aspects of it that program development was doing and so forth, and worked with some of that, and that was, of course, the forerunner of some of the other propulsion things that were going to come on later on. Again, it was a totally new experience for me, working with true U-graph engineering. I mean, there was nothing about hardware. And the other, probably one of the other things that really struck me home, in Space Station, I'd been used to dealing in certainly many millions of dollars and even billions, and in program development, you worried about thousands of dollars, 5,000, 10,000 for a program or something that you wanted to keep going. It was a real kind of eye-opener to me, how program development worked. But at that time, it was still working very well, because they would work with our counterparts up at NASA headquarters and get projects, get some funding, a little seed money to keep things going. Probably the master at that was Whit Brantley. Whit could just he could talk anybody into anything, I think, up there, and would had a brilliant mind too of things to do. It was another eye-opener to me is the breadth of things that program development was working on at the time. I mean, a lot of things way out in the future. It's just incredible the kind of things that they were working on, and to me that just kind of pumped me up. You know, this was something. Even though they may not have been into the hardware world, they were into future kind of things that you could really dream about, and a lot of fun. And I had some incredible young people that hardworking. That worked for us at the time, and then Jim McMillian left, and I guess about the time the transition between Jack Lee and Porter Bridwell took place, and then Jim McMillian decided to retire, and Porter made me the head of program development, and it was kind of nice, but it was kind of, to me, a little bit of being a deputy of something, that was okay, like in Space Station or something, or even program development. But when suddenly you were the guy in charge, and to me that was different than being chief engineer. You know, chief engineer or even the payload ops director, you had a lot of responsibility, but it wasn't in my mind, at least at the level of program development or something like that. But anyway, I learned a lot. I'd learned a lot from Jim. I'd learned a whole lot from George Hobson. And so, it went pretty well. I had a very good team of people that worked for me up there. And it was a lot of fun. We actually moved another one of these things where they do where they call it the old sandbox turnover or whatever, that they moved all of the people from program development over into 4203. Well, I had nice offices up on the 9th floor, and my deputy and so forth, and they wanted to know if I wanted to stay there. And I said, well, no, not if my people are going to be over in 4203. So I moved back over to 4203. And but anyway, then of course Porter left. And then we were basically without a center director. Carolyn Greiner did a fine job in the interim period. And I know she was hoping to get the job, but in the end, Dan Golden brought in Art Stevenson. And for whatever reason, Art and I seemed to hit it off from the very beginning. And sometime after that, I remember him calling me into his office, and I think Dick Marmon was about to retire, and so I think maybe Carolyn had probably recommended that I take over that office, the Flight Projects office, I think it was called at the time. So, since I was in SES, when Art called me, as a matter of fact, I was in the shower, and my wife said, "It's your boss, you better take it." And so I stepped out, and took it, and he said, "You wanted me to take over the Flight Projects office?" And I said, "Hey, I'm an SES, so wherever you tell me to go, that's fine."
I know how that is.
Yeah. So anyway, I left program development and went over to what was then the Flight Projects office, and then we went through this real big reorganization at the center. And I remember Art Stevenson calling me into his office and showing me the new organization. And one of my first questions was, "Where is program development?" He said, "Well, we're going to do that in each of these other offices." They had a propulsion office, and they had a Flight Projects office, and they had some kind of other shuttle office, of course. Said, "We're going to let each of them develop further things." Now, I said, "Art, you're taking out what's the heart of some of the things that Marshall has done over the years. You've got a nucleus of people. If you spread them out, you'll lose that. But in the end, he was a boss, and so it was decided to do away with program development, which I told him at that time was a mistake. I think it still was a mistake, even to this day, to separate all those people. I got a few of them in my organization, which was then called the Flight Projects Directorate. And we had, it was kind of a misnomer since other than some space lab work that we did and that was probably then my last life or my second life in space station was because a lot of the space station work was done in that organization. But there were other flight projects that should have been in that organization, I guess, looking back on it, that weren't.
Gravity Probe B?
Gravity Probe B was over in the science area. That was fine. I worked with them later on when I was the associate director. But in any case, we worked through that. We built up that organization. We had to kind of flesh it out. Had to put the different sub-tiers in place. That was kind of an interesting time. You know, everybody obviously, the nice thing that I was the head of it, you know,
Yeah.
and I had actually wanted Jack Bullman, who had been my deputy during my last few months in program development, I wanted him to be my deputy in the Flight Projects Director, but Carolyn Greiner said, no, we got Jan Davis, as we were going to bring her up from JSC. So Jan was my deputy, and we were trying to pull all of this together, and she was not up here yet during that time. So anyway, we worked that. We had a lot of issues with our friends down at JSC, obviously, and on the space station that I had to deal with. Again, pulling a lot, some of which were new people, some of which were old friends, and so that helped out. And we worked together, I think, very well for the time being. And but anyway, space station was probably the primary thing in that organization, although there were space lab was still in there, vestige of the space lab and the other things, the not Hubble, but what was the one?
AXF.
AXF was in that organization also. Of course, it was flying by that time.
Yeah.
It was after. So anyway, we stood up Flight Projects Directorate, and I was the head of that for several years. Probably the biggest problem in the space station again was budgetary. You know, the Boeing guys had a really hard time, you know, coming in with a budget and a schedule and then living by it. You know, every time they'd come to me, I'd tell them, "Are you sure you've looked at everything?" I've tried to ask them the right kind of questions. Yeah. And a month later, they'd be out of the box already. And that was just a constant battle with the people at Boeing. And I'm not sure to this day it's been totally resolved. But interestingly enough, they went through a number of managers over there. And I think finally, interestingly enough, they put my brother in charge of that portion of it. And I hate to brag on my brother, but I think Volker did a lot to straighten out what was going on there. I think he has a lot more of my father in him than I do. But in any case, worked on that for quite a number of years, and then, let's see, it must have been in 2001 sometime. Again, I was in the shower, and my wife calls me to the phone and said, "It's your boss again, it's Art Stevenson," and he's asked if I would come up and help Sid Socher out as associate director of the center.
Sid was getting a little ill at the
Sid
time.
had been sick for quite some time and Art perceived him to be on a downhill road, and I think he was, but I'll have to say, especially, I mean, I'd known Sid for many years and knew him very well for the last 2 or 3 years of his life. And
He was a
Sid
fighter.
was a fighter. He
really was.
wouldn't let anything go. I'll have to say his personality changed a lot after he got cancer. Sid was evidently a real bull in a china shop in his early career and through some of the other offices that he had. But I think after the cancer, he became a lot. I think he realized that there was more to life than just work, and that treating people nicely and so forth. And he was a joy to work with, and I missed him very much after he was gone. But then as associate director, then you take on a lot of jobs that the center director and the deputy center director just don't want to do. and some of them are fun, and some of them are
Some
not
of them
so
aren't,
much
right.
fun. You know, the safety program was one of the things I got put in charge of, and it's a learning experience. Through my career, I used to kid people about having a hard time keeping a job, and I did change jobs a lot, but each new job brought me new experiences, new challenges that I had to deal with, and I think helped me grow in my career. I think that if I had stayed in structures, you know, when I look at some of my peers that were there, some of my peers that were a whole lot better than I was. One of the comes to mind is a guy named John Admire. John and I worked together in the early 60s on the Apollo program and the structures there, and John got his PhD at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa and was just a whiz-bang kind of guy. But he stayed down there, you know, and that's what he was good at. And now
That's what he enjoyed.
and that's what he enjoyed. I enjoyed other things, and certainly wouldn't have ever made it to be associate director of the Marshall.
Well, how long were you associate director?
I want to say 3 years. Yeah, three or 4 years. I was associate director, and then it was. I just felt like it was time to leave. 2004. In the year 2000, I found out I had prostate cancer, and so I dealt with that. And as a matter of fact, I guess after the surgery, I didn't take care of it, and gone through a couple of series of radiation treatment. But you know, I decided I need to go out and enjoy life a little bit. And so in 2004, I guess I was, 66, going on 67 at the time that year, 68, I guess I was 67. I decided to just retire from the center. And matter of fact, I retired on July the 3rd in 2004, and I'd come to work on July the 5th in 1960. So it was touched there 44 years. Of course, they counted my co-op time, so my total time was like 46 years or something like that.
That's a long career in that.
Yes, it is. But I tell you what, it was enjoyable, and there's people have asked me, is there any, you know, the typical question, is there anything that you would change? No. You know, there was good times and bad times by all of us, and I think that I had certainly a whole lot more good times than I did bad times. Being part of the Apollo landing, Skylab, Space Lab, the first big international human program, being part of those was just, and then being part of the space station also. So I feel like, you know, I did about as well as anybody. The only program I think I didn't work on as far as the human space programs was shuttle in a direct sense. I worked in an indirect sense on shuttle.
Well, that's maybe a great place to end
Yeah.
the conversation. We're very pleased you came to chat with us.
Thank you very much
Thank you very much.
asking me to come. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
you.